At 9:17 on a Monday morning, Charlotte Voss picked up the phone and called the police to remove a man in a faded flannel shirt from the lobby of Nexvara Capital. The man did not argue, he did not raise his voice. He simply looked her in the eye and said exactly one sentence. "You are calling the police to throw the person who owns half of this building out the front door." Charlotte almost smiled, the smile of some certain they were dealing with a delusional stranger. She had a meeting in less than 2 hours that would define her career. She had a presentation polished down to the last decimal point. She had every reason in the world to believe she was right. What she did not have was the truth about how Nexvara Capital had been built, and who had built it. What happens when the officers arrive, and why do they turn to look at Charlotte instead? Stay with this story to the end. Nexvara Capital occupied the top 14 floors of a 22-story glass tower on the western edge of Chicago's financial district. The building's exterior was steel-framed with blue-tinted glass panels and a silver logo mounted above the entrance. Clean, deliberate, the kind of architecture designed to communicate permanence without saying a word. Inside, the lobby ran floor-to-ceiling in white marble and recessed lighting, with a real-time market display flickering green and amber on the far wall. The company managed private investment funds concentrated in commercial real estate, and in 2 years under its current chief executive, it had grown annual revenue by 34%. It had also grown its reputation. In the narrowly competitive world of Midwest private equity, the Nexvara name now carried weight. Not the historic inherited weight of the old institutional firms, but the sharper, more uncomfortable weight of a company that had recently started winning deals those older firms expected to keep for themselves. Most of that momentum had a single name attached to it, Charlotte Voss. She had taken the chief executive position at 31, the youngest person appointed to that role in Nexvara's history, and she had spent every day since turning that fact from a footnote into a credential. Before Nexvara, she had spent 4 years at a mid-sized institutional investment firm in Detroit, where she had built a reputation for restructuring underperforming fund portfolios with a precision that made senior partners uncomfortable in the way that very capable younger people often make senior partners uncomfortable. She arrived at 7:45 each morning without exception, wore charcoal or slate gray almost exclusively, and kept her dark hair pulled tight at the back of her neck. She had a way of walking through a building that communicated forward motion without urgency, as though the space around her was always slightly arranged in her favor. She did not entertain ambiguity in financial documents. She did not make decisions based on intuition when data was available, and she did not tolerate interruptions during critical preparation windows. She had built her professional identity on exactly those habits, and they had served her well. That Monday was the most critical preparation window of her tenure. At 11 o'clock that morning, a delegation from Hallmark Ventures was scheduled to arrive at Nexvara's 18th floor conference room to sign a preliminary memorandum of understanding, the first formal step in a $400 million acquisition deal that had been 18 months in the making. Charlotte had reviewed the presentation deck 4 times over the weekend. She knew every number, every projection, every counter-argument the Hallmark team might raise. The deck was ready, the room was ready, Charlotte was ready. Standing beside her on the 18th floor that morning was Adrian Cole, Nexvara's chief financial officer. A man of 47 with silver-streaked hair and the particular kind of calm that comes from knowing something no one else in the room knows. Adrian had been with Nexvara for 6 years, through 2 changes in leadership, through 1 near miss in a debt restructuring, through the quiet period after Logan Whitmore's death when the company had run on momentum and institutional memory more than on active direction. He had positioned himself carefully through all of it, always useful, always moderate, always the person in the room who could say the thing that needed to be said in the way that allowed everyone else to agree with it. He was the person who had briefed Charlotte during her first week about the company's ownership structure, telling her with quiet confidence that all founding shares had long since been converted into the general operating fund, fully absorbed, no outstanding claims from any prior equity holders. Charlotte had no reason at the time to question it. She did not question it now, she was focused on the deal. What Charlotte did not know, and what would take the entire morning to unravel, was that a different conversation had been happening in the background for nearly a year. Adrian Cole had begun quietly engineering the sale of Nexvara Capital to Hallmark Ventures without disclosing a structural problem at the center of the transaction. 50% of the company's shares were legally owned by a man who had not been present at a single board meeting in 3 years, had not been contacted about the acquisition, and whose rights had been targeted for systematic elimination through a clause buried inside an amendment to the company's Articles of Incorporation. The clause described something it called an inactivity conversion provision, which purported to reclassify the voting rights of any founding shareholder who had not participated in governance activities for a defined period. The clause had been inserted into a revised charter document the previous spring, approved at a board meeting that Elijah Monroe did not attend and was not formally notified about. It was not in the original founding contract. It had never been agreed to, and the man it was written to erase had just walked through the front door. Elijah Monroe had co-founded Nexvara Capital 11 years earlier with his college roommate, Logan Whitmore. They had started the company in a rented office that cost $400 a month, working from 2 folding tables pushed together in the center of the room, with one shared laptop and a whiteboard that never got fully erased because there was always something more important being written on it. The office smelled like old carpet and coffee and the particular kind of ambition that has not yet been tested, and both of them understood that what they were attempting had about the same probability of working as most things that eventually work. Slightly less than even odds, strongly dependent on the quality of the people involved. Logan handled client relationships and day-to-day operations, moving fast, talking fast, filling every room he entered with enough energy for 3 people. He had a memory for names and a talent for making people feel that they had been understood, which is a rarer skill in financial services than it ought to be. Elijah handled the structural side, the legal architecture, the capital frameworks, the fine print that nobody wanted to read but that determined whether everything else held together under pressure. He read every contract twice before signing it, built redundancy into every agreement, and had an instinct for the sentence buried on page 17 that would matter enormously 3 years later when no one remembered agreeing to it. They were different in almost every way that mattered, and those differences had made the company work. The 50-50 split of founding shares had never been a negotiation. It was a given, written into the original contract on the day they signed, notarized and registered with the state of Illinois, as clear and permanent as either of them could make it. They had shaken hands on it before the ink was dry, and neither of them ever revisited the subject. 3 years before the morning in question, Logan Whitmore was killed in a traffic accident on Interstate 90. He was 41 years old, with plans he had written on a legal pad the week before, and a meeting scheduled for the following Tuesday that no one remembered to cancel for 6 days. The loss hit Elijah in a way he did not fully understand at the time. Not all at once, but in waves over months, arriving without warning and receding without resolution. His wife had died the year before from an illness that had moved faster than anyone expected. He was, by the time the grief had finished reshaping him, a different person living in a life that no longer looked like the one he had planned for. He signed a temporary governance transfer agreement with the board, giving them operating authority for an indefinite period while he stepped back from all active involvement. The agreement was specific on one point above all others. Elijah Monroe retained full ownership of his 50% stake. He retained voting rights. He retained veto authority over any transaction affecting the company's fundamental ownership structure. He was not selling anything. He was not converting anything. He was simply not going to be in the building. He had trusted that to be enough. For 2 years it was. The board appointed Charlotte Voss as chief executive. The company performed well under her direction, and Elijah received quarterly financial summaries from his attorney without reviewing them closely. He lived in a house in the western suburbs, rebuilt daily routines slowly, managed a small personal investment portfolio to keep his mind engaged, and kept his distance from the world he had built with Logan. He was not monitoring governance amendment filings. He was not auditing charter modifications. He had transferred operating control to people he believed were competent and trustworthy, and he had assumed, correctly for a time, that the legal architecture he had built into the founding contract would protect him from the kind of maneuver that requires a person to not be watching. That assumption was the only thing Adrian Cole needed. 3 weeks before the Monday in question, Grace Bennett, Elijah's attorney of 9 years, a woman who read governance documents the way other people read weather forecasts with careful attention to what they implied about what was coming, received a routine board communication in the mail. It was printed on official letterhead, describing a series of governance updates, with the amended charter document attached as an exhibit, Grace read the inactivity conversion provision on page 11. She read it again. Then she called Elijah. She told him what the clause said, what it would do to his voting rights if left unchallenged, and how much time remained before the threshold conditions it described would be met. She also told him that the amendment bore no signature from him or from any authorized representative, which meant it had been approved in direct violation of Article 9, Section 3 of the founding contract. Elijah listened to all of it without speaking. There was a long silence on the line. When he finally responded, he said only that he would go to the building himself. Grace told him she would meet him there. He arrived at 9:12 that Monday morning wearing the flannel shirt, carrying no briefcase, no badge, no appointment, no visible credential of any kind. He walked across the marble lobby to the reception desk and told the young woman behind it, Madison Cruz, who had been at Nexvara for less than a year and had the careful professionalism of someone still learning what the job required, that his name was Elijah Monroe, that he was a co-founder of the company, and that he needed to speak with the chief executive about an urgent matter concerning his rights as a founding shareholder. Madison typed his name into the internal contact system. The system returned no employee record, no scheduled appointment, no cross-reference to any active file. 2 months earlier, Samuel Hartwell, head of Nexvara's legal department and a man who communicated with Adrian Cole several times a week, had removed Elijah's name from the active internal directory under the description of a records cleanup ahead of the merger and acquisition transition. Madison looked at the screen, then looked at Elijah, then pressed the button for the head of security. Hunter Reeves came down from the 3rd floor and asked Elijah to vacate the premises, citing the absence of any record of his identity or appointment in the system. Elijah declined with an evenness in his voice that Hunter would think about later. He sat down in one of the lobby chairs near the east wall, withdrew a thick envelope from his jacket, placed it on his knee, and waited without speaking. There was something in the way he sat, not aggressive, not performative, simply settled, that made the security guard hesitate before picking up his radio. Hunter described the situation to the 18th floor in 3 sentences. Charlotte asked how long the man had been there. Hunter said 17 minutes. Charlotte said to give him 15 more, and if he had not left, to call her back, and she returned to the agenda in her hand. Adrian Cole, standing 4 feet away with a coffee cup and a tablet, said without looking up that this was a known tactic, that before major transactions, people occasionally presented fabricated claims against company assets, and that allowing it to extend into the hallmark arrival window would introduce a complication that the morning did not need. He said this in the same tone he used when recommending a change in amortization schedule. Mild, measured, as though the outcome were already obvious. Charlotte did not respond to it directly, but she heard it. When Hunter called back exactly 15 minutes later to confirm the man had not moved, Charlotte made a decision she would spend the next 8 weeks examining. She rode the elevator down to the lobby herself because she preferred direct resolution over delegation when time was limited, and because she wanted the matter closed before 10 o'clock. She stepped onto the marble floor and crossed to where Elijah Monroe was sitting. She saw a man in his mid-30s, dark-haired still, with the kind of patience that does not come from having nothing to lose but from having already decided precisely and without drama what he was willing to lose and what he was not. He was not looking at his phone. He was not surveying the lobby. The envelope rested on his knee without trembling. Charlotte introduced herself. Elijah set the envelope on the chair beside him and stood. He said his name. He told her he held 50% of the company's original founding shares, that he had executed a temporary governance withdrawal 3 years ago that had not in any way affected his equity ownership, and that he had come to the building directly because he had learned of an amendment to the governing charter that had been introduced and voted upon without his consent. An amendment he believed was designed to eliminate his rights ahead of a transaction he had never been informed about. Charlotte kept her expression level. She told him that her first-week briefing from senior leadership had included explicit confirmation that all founding equity had been converted and absorbed into the operating structure before her tenure, and that the name Elijah Monroe appeared in no current ownership record available to her. She said the company's legal department maintained all shareholder documentation and had given her no indication that any active founding equity stake existed. Elijah listened to all of it. He asked, quietly, who had given her that briefing. Charlotte did not answer. It was not her habit to explain her internal processes to unscheduled visitors, regardless of what they claimed. Just then, Samuel Hartwell stepped off the elevator and walked across the lobby with the unhurried pace of someone who had been alerted to the situation and had come to help manage it. Charlotte turned to him immediately and asked whether he recognized the man standing in front of them. Samuel Hartwell looked at Elijah Monroe, a man whose founding documents he had personally reviewed, whose signature appeared on contracts Samuel had accessed dozens of times, and shook his head. He said the name did not correspond to any individual in the current shareholder registry maintained by his department. That was the moment everything could have turned. Charlotte had a question she could not fully silence. A small, inconvenient, factual question about how this man knew the name of the company that was arriving at 11 o'clock. She had not published the Hallmark collection. It had not appeared in any press coverage. There were fewer than 20 people inside Nexvara who knew the counterparty's identity. She pushed the question aside. She handed back the 3 documents Elijah had removed from the envelope and laid out for her to examine. Pages she had not picked up, had not held, had not read, and told him plainly that the building was private property and that she was requesting, for the final time, that he leave. Elijah did not move. He said that any memorandum signed with Hallmark Ventures that morning, without his written consent as a 50% equity partner, would constitute a breach of the founding contract, and that every document executed under it would face immediate legal invalidation. Charlotte said, without heat, that no one held rights over half of this building unless their name existed in a valid legal record, and his did not. Then she walked back to the elevator, called the front desk, and asked them to contact the Chicago Police Department. The 2 officers who arrived 20 minutes later were professionals who moved at a deliberate pace and asked their questions in a particular order. In the lobby during the time between Charlotte's phone call and the officer's arrival, a quiet stalemate held the space. Elijah had returned to the east wall chair without being asked and resumed the stillness he had maintained since entering the building. Madison Cruz at the reception desk had glanced at him at least a dozen times. She had worked 3 years at a mid-size accounting firm before coming to Nexvara and had been trained, in the general way that receptionists are trained, to recognize when a situation felt wrong without being able to articulate why. This situation felt wrong. The people who came to Nexvara with fraudulent claims were typically either very agitated or very prepared in a performative way. They brought too much documentation, spoke too quickly, gave the impression of a rehearsal in progress. The man sitting by the east wall had none of those characteristics. He was quiet in the way of someone who had nothing to prove by being quiet, and who had brought exactly the documentation he needed and nothing more. She did not say any of this to anyone. It was not her place to say it, but she thought it. The officers arrived, approached Elijah, identified themselves, and asked him to explain why he had declined multiple requests to leave. Elijah stood up, handed over his identification, opened the envelope, and placed 3 documents on the low table in front of the officers without speaking. The first was a notarized copy of the 2013 founding contract, with his name listed as a 50% equity partner alongside Logan Whitmore's. The second was a share certificate bearing his name, a certificate number, and a registration confirmation from the Illinois Securities Division. The third was a letter from Grace Bennett addressed to the Nexvara Board of Directors 3 weeks prior, formally objecting to the inactivity conversion provision and citing by article and section number the specific clause of the founding contract that prohibited any amendment to equity structure without the written consent of all founding shareholders. The first officer read through the documents slowly. He passed them to his partner, who read them as well. A look passed between them, not dramatic, just communicative, the kind of look 2 experienced people exchange when a situation is not what it was described to be. The first officer turned toward Hunter Reeves and asked whether the chief executive could come back down to the lobby. He said there were some records that needed clarification before any further steps could be taken. Charlotte stepped out of the elevator 2 minutes later and crossed the lobby for the second time that morning. The 2 stacks of documents were now on the low table near the east wall chairs, the 3 pages from Elijah's envelope, and the shareholder registry Samuel Hartwell had brought down from the legal department in a manila folder. The officer explained in measured, plain terms that the documentation presented by the individual they had been called to remove appeared to conflict directly with the records provided by the company's internal counsel. He said this was not a criminal trespass matter but a civil dispute over competing ownership claims, which was outside their authority to resolve, and that both versions of the record could not simultaneously be legally valid. He said the company should refrain from executing any ownership-related transaction until the discrepancy was formally clarified. Charlotte looked at the founding contract on the table. She looked at the registration number on the share certificate. She looked at the notary seal on the bottom of the first page, its embossed circle pressed into the paper 11 years ago in a room she had never seen. She looked at Samuel Hartwell. He was looking at the floor. Then the lobby door opened and Grace Bennett walked in. Grace was 40 years old and had been practicing corporate law for 15 years, and she moved through the marble lobby with the quiet authority of someone who had been in rooms like this many times and was not impressed by the marble. She introduced herself to the officers, to Charlotte, and to Hunter Reeves. She placed her leather document case on the reception desk, opened it, and laid out a complete paper record. The original 2013 founding contract with notarization and chain of custody log, the share certificate with its Illinois Securities Division filing confirmation, the 2021 board meeting minutes explicitly recording that Elijah's governance withdrawal did not transfer or diminish his equity rights, and the amended charter from the previous spring with a red-tabbed annotation on page 11. The annotation noted 4 words, "No founding shareholder signature." Below it, in her own hand, Violet's Article 9, Section 3. She presented all of it without raising her voice, without rhetorical flourish, with the particular economy of language that comes from knowing that the documents are doing most of the work and that her job is simply to make sure everyone in the room is looking at the same page. The second officer looked at the 2 bodies of documentation side by side and said, for the record, that he and his partner were not in a position to adjudicate the matter and that he recommended the company make no further moves on ownership-related transactions until the conflict was resolved through appropriate legal channels. He directed this recommendation to Charlotte. Then both officers thanked her for her time, picked up their caps from the desk, and walked out through the glass doors into the morning. Charlotte stood in the lobby and did not speak for a full 10 seconds. She turned to look at Adrian Cole, who had materialized at some point in the last 20 minutes near the far end of the reception desk, standing with his hands folded and his expression arranged in a way that communicated calm but communicated it too deliberately, the way a performance communicates calm rather than the way calm actually looks. She looked at Samuel Hartwell, who had found a point on the marble floor and was directing all of his attention at it. She looked at the documents still spread across the table. Then she looked at Elijah Monroe, standing a few feet away in the flannel shirt he had worn when he walked in, not triumphant, not angry, just still. The same undemonstrative stillness he had carried with him since the moment he crossed the threshold 2 hours ago, the stillness of someone who has been correct about something for a long time and does not need to announce it. She told Hunter Reeves to call up to the 18th floor and postpone the Hallmark meeting by 2 hours. Then she walked toward the elevator. Just before the doors opened, without turning around, she said, "Mr. Monroe, bring your attorney." The 18th floor conference room had floor-to-ceiling windows with a view of the city's western corridor, pale oak furniture, and the kind of institutional quiet that well-designed rooms hold when the air conditioning is on and no one is speaking. Charlotte sent a brief email to the Hallmark delegation, apologized for the delay, and cited an internal technical matter that required immediate attention. She kept the language precise and gave away nothing. 3 board members who had arrived early for the 11 o'clock signing, Liam Forrest, Owen Greer, and Isaac Caldwell, were brought into the room. Adrian Cole and Samuel Hartwell were also asked to attend. Charlotte said the meeting was about a governance matter. She did not say more than that. When everyone was seated, Grace Bennett set her document case on the table and began to speak. She did not use accusatory language. She used the language of sequence and documentation. She worked forward from the 2013 founding contract, document by document, date by date, registration number by registration number, building the record the way a careful person builds a case, not through argument but through the accumulation of unambiguous facts. She described the equity structure the founding contract established, what it required for any amendment affecting founding shareholder rights, what the 2021 withdrawal agreement had and had not transferred, and what the amended charter from the previous spring represented in light of all of that. She reached the inactivity conversion provision on page 11 and stopped. She said the provision had been introduced and voted upon at a board meeting for which Elijah Monroe received no proper notification as a party holding consent rights under Article 9, Section 3. She said no signature from Elijah Monroe or any authorized representative appeared on the amended document. She said the amendment was therefore void under the plain terms of the contract that had governed the company since its founding. Liam Forrest, the longest-serving board member, asked to see the founding contract beside the amended charter. He read both documents in silence for close to 3 minutes. When he looked up, he did not look at Grace. He looked at Samuel Hartwell and asked who had specifically drafted the inactivity conversion provision, and who had authorized the amendment to proceed to a board vote without ensuring that the founding shareholder with documented consent rights over such changes had received proper notification. Samuel said nothing. Isaac Caldwell turned to Adrian Cole and asked whether Adrian, at the time the amendment was introduced, had been aware that Elijah Monroe had not been properly notified and had not provided consent. Adrian said the amendment had gone through the standard governance process. Caldwell said that was not the question he had asked, and he repeated the question. The room was quiet. Grace placed one more document on the table. It was a printed series of internal emails between Adrian Cole and an outside consulting firm, with a subject line that read, Pre-transaction ownership simplification, Q2 timeline. The content of those emails described a shared objective of rationalizing what the consulting firm called the legacy equity position before the acquisition window opened, and Adrian's responses confirmed both his understanding of the objective and the preferred approach for achieving it. Owen Greer, who had not said a word since sitting down, placed his pen flat on the table. He looked at Adrian Cole for a long moment. Then he said, in a voice that was fully level and allowed no interpretation, that if what Grace Bennett had presented was accurate, and he had read every document on the table and had no reason to believe it was not, then the chief financial officer had conducted 18 months of acquisition negotiations while knowingly working to eliminate the rights of the person who owned half of the company, without disclosing that conflict of interest to the board, to the chief executive, or to the counterparty. He said there was a specific legal term for that kind of conduct. He did not say it aloud. He did not need to. Adrian Cole raised his voice for the first and only time that morning. He said the board had approved the transaction, that governance procedures had been followed, that the inactivity provision had been voted through by a legitimate quorum. Grace responded that a board quorum did not have the authority to override a consent right held by a founding shareholder under the original contract, that this was not a matter of interpretation but of the plain text of the clause both sides of the table had been looking at for the last 40 minutes. Adrian said founding contracts were subject to subsequent amendment by the board. Grace said that was precisely what Article 9, Section 3 prohibited without Elijah Monroe's written agreement. There was a silence after that, the kind that settles into a room and makes further argument feel beside the point. Charlotte had not spoken for more than 20 minutes. She had been listening, and while she listened, she had been working backward through everything she had been told in the 2 years since she accepted the chief executive role. The first week briefing, the language about converting and absorbing founding equity, the complete absence in every document she had been given access to of the name Elijah Monroe as an active rights holder. She had been given a map of this company, and the map had been drawn by the wrong person with a deliberate omission at its center. She was an executive who prided herself on knowing the ground beneath her decisions, on sourcing, on verification, on building the kind of understanding that holds up when pressure is applied. She had chaired 72 board meetings. She had renegotiated 3 major fund agreements. She had restructured a bond portfolio during a liquidity crunch that most of the senior team had been privately certain would end her career before it fully began. And through all of that, she had not independently verified the most foundational fact about the company she was running: who owned it. The person giving her that version of events had been the person she had been positioned to trust, and she had been positioned to trust him by people who stood to benefit from her not looking more carefully. She understood that now with a clarity that was not comfortable, and she was not the kind of person who softened uncomfortable truths to make them easier to hold. She looked at Liam Forrest and told him she wanted an independent audit of every governance document filed in the last 3 years, starting that week and completing within 30 days. She asked Forrest, Greer, and Caldwell for their agreement and received it from all 3. She looked at Samuel Hartwell and said his full cooperation with the audit would be expected, and that full access to the legal department's document archives would begin that afternoon. Then she looked at Adrian Cole and told him, in a tone that contained no heat and no opening for debate, that his duties as chief financial officer were suspended immediately, effective that moment, pending the results of the investigation. Adrian stood and said a suspension required a formal board action. Liam Forrest said the board had a quorum present and that if Cole preferred a vote, they would take one now. Adrian picked up his phone from the table. He looked once around the room, at Charlotte, at the board members, at Grace Bennett, at the documents that remained spread across the pale oak surface, and then he left. Samuel Hartwell sat in his chair and looked at nothing. Charlotte sent the formal postponement notice to Hallmark Ventures 40 minutes later. Their lead negotiator replied within the hour, asking whether the underlying transaction remained viable. Charlotte wrote back that the matter was under internal review and that she would provide an update within 30 days. That afternoon, she knocked on the door of the temporary office she had assigned to Elijah and Grace for their document review. She carried 2 cups of coffee from the machine on the floor above, not a gesture, just a practical detail, and set one in front of Elijah without ceremony. She sat down across from him. Grace was in the corridor on a phone call, which gave the office a quiet that Charlotte was aware of and did not try to fill with on unnecessary words. She did not make a speech. She asked the question that had stayed with her since the lobby. That he could have initiated legal proceedings from outside the building, could have filed an injunction, engaged the board through written channels, done any of it without setting foot in the lobby at all. And she wanted to know why he had come in person. Elijah looked at the coffee cup for a moment before answering, as though the question deserved that pause. He said the company had been built at 2 folding tables in a room without air conditioning, by 2 people who had no reputation and no guarantee and nothing to show for themselves except the work and the terms of an agreement they had kept to the letter. He said what they had built had mattered to him long before it was worth anything to anyone else. Before the glass tower, before the Hallmark delegation, before it became a name that appeared in financial press coverage. He said that if someone was going to try to take half of that while he was not watching, he needed to be in the room when that was addressed. Not in a document, not through a legal intermediary filing papers in a courthouse. Neither of them would sit in together. In the room, Charlotte turned her coffee cup slowly on the desk between them. She said that the information she had been given when she took the job had been wrong, and that the responsibility for not independently verifying it was hers, not entirely, but substantially, and she was not interested in distributing that responsibility in a way that reduced her portion of it. She said she had run the company for 2 years on a factually incorrect understanding of who she was running it for, and that regardless of how that error had been engineered, she was the one who had not caught it. Elijah looked at her for a moment. He said he believed her, and he said it in a way that suggested the statement had weight, that it was not politeness, but a conclusion he had arrived at and was willing to hold. The independent audit was completed in 31 days. Its findings confirmed every element of Grace Bennett's presentation. The inactivity conversion provision was formally declared void by unanimous board vote. Elijah Monroe's 50% equity stake was restored to full standing, including voting rights, veto authority over major transactions, and the right to board representation. Samuel Hartwell's employment was terminated the day the audit results were published. Adrian Cole had submitted his resignation 2 weeks before that, before the audit was complete, a calculation that surprised no one who had watched him leave the conference room. Both men subsequently faced civil litigation initiated jointly by the company and by Elijah Monroe's legal team, alleging fraudulent manipulation of corporate governance records and breach of fiduciary duty to the company's shareholders. The litigation moved through the legal system without drama, the way financial fraud cases usually do, slowly with a great deal of paper and very little of the clarity that the original events had possessed. Hallmark Ventures contacted Nexvara 6 days after the audit concluded. Their message was direct. They remained interested in the acquisition and wanted to confirm whether the ownership structure was now fully resolved and whether conversations could resume. Charlotte forwarded the message to Elijah without adding anything to it. His reply was 2 sentences. He said he was open to a conversation. He said he would need to be present at any future meetings. The calendar invitation for the next session with the Hallmark team included his name on the attendee list. It was the first time his name had appeared on any Nexvara meeting record in 3 years. 8 weeks after the morning in the lobby, Elijah Monroe walked into Nexvara Capital's 18th floor boardroom for his first active board meeting in 3 years. He wore a white button-down shirt and dark trousers and no jacket. The pale oak table was the same. The windows were the same. The city was spread out flat and gray in the early November light beyond the glass. Charlotte Voss sat at the far end of the table. There were 6 other people in the room, all of them fully briefed on what had happened over the previous 2 months, none of them making reference to it. The Hallmark acquisition was still on the table, restructured, redocumented, and now being negotiated with both halves of the company's founding equity represented and accounted for. It was a slower process than the one Adrian Cole had been managing. It was also, for the first time, a complete one. Charlotte opened the meeting with a procedural summary and called the first agenda item. Elijah opened the folder in front of him and began reading. The room proceeded the way boardrooms are supposed to proceed, with order and attention and the careful work of people responsible for something larger than any one of them. Nobody mentioned the lobby. Nobody mentioned the flannel shirt or the police officers, or the 2 stacks of documents on the reception desk, or the morning that had started with a phone call and ended with the full shape of the company visible again for the first time in years. They did not need to mention any of it. The understanding of what had happened, and what it had required to put right, was present in the room without needing to be named. Some things are buried not because they are weak, but because the people doing the burying understand that the moment they surface fully into the light, there will no longer be room for the lie.